and I'm happy to introduce first Andreas Rausche, who is an assistant professor for media culture studies at the Albert-Ludwigs-Universität in Freiburg im Breisgau. He was a senior lecturer at the Department for Media Studies at the University of Siegen and a visiting professor of media studies at the Christian Albrechts Universität in Kiel. And he was at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz as well. And he writes as a journalist for several magazines on film and popular culture. And he's a renowned game studies scholar. And I think we just started to supervise a PhD student together. So I look forward to working together. And now I look forward to your paper on spoiling and playing with a plot twist.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to this exciting conference. To pick up the discussion on world building, I think a lot of the discussion around game studies has to do with this too, because the question I want to deal with in the next 20 minutes is how spoiler alerts got into games. Because if you consider classic concepts of games, the spoiling would rather lie in not playing by the rules or cheating on someone, but not really in giving away the story or a plot twist. So I want to deal with three aspects in the following 20 minutes. The first will be the circle of repetition and variation that concerns game mechanics as well as genre concepts. Then in a second step, I want to take a look at genre tropes and how they connect to game mechanics, because I think the introduction of spoilers to games has a lot to do with genre settings and genre tropes being adapted into video as well as board games. And as a third step, I want to take an outlook at how the development in video games feeds back into board games. And this somehow spoils what Johann Huizinga called the magic circle. The idea in his book Homo Ludens from 1938 is that games occur within a separated space from reality. And as soon as you introduce elements like plot development or the combination of different games chained together to create a kind of dramaturgy, you leave the classic idea of the repeatable game within a magic circle. For example, the more traditional approach towards genre tropes can be found in the classic board game Clue from 1949. In this game, you have a scenario that is very similar to Agatha Christie's novels. 6 suspects, a well-known landlord has been murdered in a lonely house, and you have to find out who was the murderer, who used what weapon, and in which room in this lonely place the murder actually took place. There can't be really a spoiler because you know one of the 6 characters will be the murder, and it's selected by chance mechanics for every new game. So there isn't really a plot twist to give away like it would be in a murder mystery whodunit novel. So Clue confirms to the concept of the classic game model that has been established by Danish game theorist Jesper Juul in 2005. He came up with 6 elements that define classic games. Those are fixed rules, variable outcomes, valorization of outcome, a player effort, and the player being attached to the outcome, and also the negotiable consequences. Here, this idea of a classic game model is very close to the concept of replayability. So the consequences are just you get a certain score for one round of the game and try to choose a better strategy in the next time. Now that plot twists come into the game, this has to do with the consequences being changed, no longer relating just to the replayable game, but rather on consequences that affect the fictional world, that change your character, or that can change the rules to the game during a playing session. So the interesting thing about Jesper Juul's model is that most of the games that are now discussed in the game mainstream or in game studies would rather fall under the category of borderline cases. For example, pen and paper role-playing games introducing story elements that can be played out for months or for several years even, if you play it long enough. And the end of every game session has consequences for the next one. So I think this new quality of consequences is the point where the spoiler and the plot twist enter the gaming procedure. One example for consequences that aren't really negotiable, but that are according to genre rules, can be found in the Western game Red Dead Redemption, an open world game by cult developer Rauscher Games from 2010. In this game, you can play a game in a game. You can enter the saloon and you can play poker. And you have the ability to cheat during playing poker. So the normal consequence would be if somebody catches you cheating in poker, that the game is over, you get thrown out of the saloon. But you can probably guess what happens in the Western, because it's defined by genre rules. You are pulled out on the main street, and the one who cheated starts a duel with you. So suddenly you switch from one game mechanic, the emulated poker game, to the duel situation where you have to rely on a completely different mechanic. These negotiations following genre tropes and rules are the chaining of several game elements that enable the basis for consequences that affect the player, the development of the plot, and the situation of the game world. So here one game leads to another gameplay, and this interlinked situations enable a dramaturgy of the game. So that here, according to genre theory, there is a perspective how plot twists, dramatic structure, and also spoilers enter the game, beyond spoiling the game by cheating, but rather by providing surprising twists within the game's structure. So on the one hand, you have this is based upon the model for film genres, the pragmatic, semi-pragmatic model by Rick Goldman, applied to video games. You have the semantics. That means you encounter familiar tropes that allow you for orientation within the game world. For example, you find yourself in a cliffhanger situation in the game Uncharted. So, in this situation, you have to escape the deadly situation and to reach the cliff again to get to safety and continue the game. This rather refers to the intuitive understanding of the gameplay mechanics. And then, on the other hand, I think this is an element that corresponds very well with information about the story or game world that are hidden from you. You have the syntax, and that means that the decisions you make have consequences within a larger story network, and the valorization of the outcome can result in consequences for the following passages of the game. So one example would be even, so this is rather on a psychological level, the different adaptations by Telltale Games based upon successful comic book and television series like The Walking Dead. There you have to make choices between moral decisions, and the game informs you that it will remember your decisions, and this will affect how other characters in the game world react towards you. This is rather kind of staging because it doesn't have as many consequences as it implies on the screen. But here, I think the interesting point is that you have dramatic consequences by the action you take. Or another example would be in the open game world of Red Dead Redemption, if you shoot the sheriff, you have to escape to the mountains and become an outlaw for a longer time, because if you enter the western town, everybody will try to chase you down. And this is the basic structure on which plot twists in games can operate. Those can remediate influences taken from well-known films or comic books or narratives. For example, the puzzle game Portal references to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. You're probably familiar with the neurotic computer hell from Stanley Kubrick's and Arthur C. Clarke's science fiction classic. This is developed further in Portal, that you encounter sinister computer system called GLaDOS that sends you on a parkour through several levels. And without giving away too much of the twist, you have to break with the gameplay mechanics that you are told, or it will end deadly for you, because you can't trust this computer system that gives you instructions. You get more and more clues that the computer system is really rather relative to hell, and you can't trust it. So at one decisive point in the game, you have to turn away from the instructions you were given and have to find alternative ways without getting into the trap the computer provided for you. Or also the mise en game, so the staging and the props available in the game can foreshadow certain plot developments. I won't give away the plot twist of Red Dead Redemption, but just that the showdown occurs in a snow landscape that is rather not typical for the traditional Westerns by John Ford or by Howard Hawks, gives you the associations for turning points coming up later. So it's reminiscent of Sergio Corbucci's Il Grande Silenzio. If you know how this film ends, you can guess at what happens in Red Dead Redemption. So it's a kind of atmosphere and mood preparing you for plot twists that are quite different from the traditional goal of winning a game. And also connecting the atmosphere of the game to the rather pessimistic revisionist Westerns by Sergio Leone or Sam Peckinpah. In contrast to situations from films and plot twists from cinema history being adapted into video games, there's also another development that I find very interesting, and that will be the focus of the third part of my talk. There are well-known films being adapted into board games. One of the most interesting cases I encountered in the last months has been a board game adaptation to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Yesterday, we have seen the scene from France where there's a tragedy involving because somebody spoilers the end of the Shining novel. Here in this case, there is really nothing to be spoiled about in regard to the plot, because that the Overlook Hotel is haunted by supernatural powers is quite obvious from the beginning in regard to the rules. The plot twists of the film are translated into the gameplay because one of the players will take the role of Jack Nicholson, but you don't know who will be the traitor who runs amok and attacks the other players. So it's a cooperative game where you have to work together to survive the winter at that Overlook Hotel, but you don't really know who of the other players will turn against you and try to sabotage you and sacrifice you to the evil forces in the hotel. So that would be the other direction where plot twists from films are turned into game rules and are reintroduced to replayable strategies of board games. But there has been another development in recent years that is quite new to game design and game concept. In a very interesting study on storytelling in modern board games, the game researcher Marco Arnaudo writes that one element of fiction that hadn't been included in board games before until very recently is the integration of the plot twist. And this introduction of the plot twist threatens the replayability defining for the classic game model as it was discussed by Jesper Juhl and others. So that you have consequences that, like in a dramatic structure, are irreversible. And this is achieved by a very interesting concept in game design, that the plot twist to the game has material consequences. I don't know who of you is familiar with the concept of legacy games that has been introduced in 2011. These are actually board games that you almost play like a tabletop or like a role-playing game in several sessions on 13 to 15 evenings. And every decision you make has consequences for the following sessions. One of the most interesting examples I studied in a self-test during the pandemic lockdown is the game Pandemic by Matt Lecock, in which you have to find in a collaborative effort the cure to a global pandemic. So very similar to the situation we have been experiencing in the last 2 years, even resulting in game designer Matt Lecock writing an opinion piece for the New York Times on what we can learn from the game design in his game that has been published in 2008 and has been adapted into the legacy variation in 2015 for our dealings with everyday life during the lockdown. And in this case, you really have a dramatic structure for the board game sessions because there are plot twists and surprises that shouldn't be spoiled. So now here we have the case of a board game that comes along with a spoiler warning, because the goals you follow for several sessions can change very abruptly. Suddenly people turn out to be traitors. Elements that you had as resources in the gameplay have to be destroyed because the plot twists informs you that certain factions are on your side, and so you have to sabotage the elements that you've built up in the former game sessions, and even elements of the game tokens have to be destroyed after the plot twist. So here we have irreversible decisions that have to be taken in cooperative play, have to be decided by the players together, and the twists materialize in the destruction of game tokens and in changes to the game board. So that this is the interesting case of a board game that you can play only once. After the 14 or 15 sessions are finished, the whole game has become useless because you can't start it from the beginning, except you buy a new game box. Of course, you could say from an economics point of view that this is what the game company wants you to do, to have failed and buy a new game box. But in regard to the dramatic structure, the introduction of plot twist to board games, this is, I think, a very interesting development in game design and in the ludonarrative architecture relating to games. So now we find several hybrid concepts in game design. Another example would be the Gothic horror game Betrayal at House on the Hill, a board game in which you have very reminiscent of Robert Weiss' The Haunting and other spook house stories. You have to do an exploration of a lonely haunted house. And in this game, you find the typical standard settings of the haunted house story, but it is connected to a plot twist that is included in the game mechanics, because there is a level meter until the haunting starts, and when the haunting starts, a plot twist will occur that is selected by chance from 50 possible scenarios. So this can mean that one of your players turns into another Jack Nicholson and tries to murder you. It can mean that the house is about to be destroyed. You have only a certain time to escape it. And so you have 50 story scenarios connected with this board game. And after the 50 story scenarios are used up, the game is also not really useless, but rather an object for academic study and reflection. So to give a short outlook on how the magic circle of the classic replayable game can be spoiled and can be transgressed, I think there are two main tendencies in current game design. The one would be from a classic ludic perspective, like the Shining board game. It's based on replayability. The consequences of the decisions in the game regard the evaluation of your performance as a player. And the challenge in playing the game is in finding the right strategies. Here, the game would be spoiled if you breach the rules, if you don't play according to the rules, or if you try to cheat on the other players or the game system. And on the other hand, there is a playful, more open perspective that is rather based on ludonarrative structures, on playing with a plot, on playing with certain dramatic structures that you try to cope with. And here you could paraphrase Wittgenstein and say we play the rules as we go along. Here the challenge is in storytelling, almost like in traditional role-playing games where you have a game master who designs the campaign for a certain game session, and the players have to find the right actions to the story, and those can have consequences across several game sessions. In this case, the game would be spoiled by losing the story. In the case of ignoring the story, or also by losing track of the storyline that you created. So here are the sources for the storytelling concepts in modern board game and Jesper Juul's classic game model. And yeah, that would be the short introduction to plot twisting in games. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.